Welcome. I'm David Nirenberg, the director and Leon Levy professor here at the Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this installment of the director's conversations on the past and present of the arts and sciences, hey, it's my own line and I forgot it. The place and practice of the arts and sciences in the past, present, and future of humanity. Now, most of the conversations we've had so far have been on disciplines that really we don't cover at the Institute. So Tamara Rojo on ballet with Jennifer Homans, or Kai Bird on biography, or Joyce DiDonato on opera. Today we're going to speak about philosophy. Now, the Institute has never had, so far as I know, if Jonathan Israel is here, he can correct me, a professorship in philosophy, but some philosophers have snuck in under other labels. Most famously, Kurt Gödel, who served the bulk of his career here as a professor of mathematics. In fact, many of our faculty, past and present, could be called philosophy adjacent, applying philosophical thought within other disciplines in the social, historical, natural, and mathematical sciences. In short, philosophy has always been important to the Institute, even if we've seldom stared that importance in the face. But philosophy has changed a great deal in this generation, in part because of the wide-ranging work of our guest, Kwame Anthony Appiah, one of the field's most versatile and original thinkers, as well as one of its most cultured individuals and gifted writers. You have a printed biography in your program, but the pages didn't suffice even to simply list the titles of his roughly 20 books, written in multiple genres and many different areas of philosophy. And I can't recite them here either without taking time from what you really want to hear, which is his voice and his ideas. So let me simply say that Anthony Appiah has transformed philosophy in part by broadening its horizons. In books like, so I'm going to kind of sneak in a short list. In books like Experiments in Ethics, he has reconnected philosophy with psychology, allowing the discipline to once again ask questions that it had been running away from for more than half a century. Moral questions, ethical questions, questions about how one could or even should live. In books like The Ethics of Identity and The Lies That Bind, Creed, Country, Color, Class, Culture, he has brought the tools of philosophy to bear on some of the great questions of our age, questions about identity and its politics, for example. And in books like In My Father's House, Africa in the Philosophy of Culture, he has opened the long and narrow halls of the history of philosophy, traditionally lined with busts of a handful of canonical figures, to thinkers and sources from all over the world. An approach elevated into an ethics and a mode of life in books like Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers. On nearly every page of every one of his books, you can experience the sense of wonder we humans feel when we are illuminated by profound ideas of whose existence we had been totally ignorant a moment before. If you prefer shorter formats, you can have some of the same experience reading his column, The Ethicist, in the New York Times, in which he can take any question. A recent one was, is it okay to name my dog for a god? And turn it into an opportunity for transformative engagement with ideas. In short, I can't think of a human more suited for what is just the latest of his many honors, the 2024 John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, awarded by the Library of Congress. Anthony, would you join me?
So I have two sides. I have a Ghanaian side and a British side from my father and my mother. And whenever anyone says nice things like that about me, I feel particularly British. I feel slightly embarrassed that anyone should think those things. So it's very nice of you to say all those nice things about me.
But I'm very sorry that the truth embarrasses.
I think the truth embarrasses everybody.
Because we don't have a school of philosophy here at the Institute, I thought I might start with a really basic question. What are we missing?
Well, one thing about philosophy is that what you'd get would depend very much on who you hired. And unless you're planning to replace all the mathematicians and the physicists and the historians and the sociologists.
Bite your tongue, rapid fire.
You wouldn't have space for all the things that a philosopher could bring because different philosophers would bring different things. But if you pick the right philosopher, which I'm sure you would, you will pick someone who will take pleasure in being here in engaging with people who are not philosophers. Because I think the great pleasure of being a philosopher is that you're allowed to think about anything you like, but then to think about it responsibly, you have to go and talk to the people who actually know about it. So if you want to do moral psychology, you actually have to talk to psychologists. You can't make it up. It's an experimental subject. If you haven't done the experiments, you don't know the answers. So I think I could turn the question around and say, I can definitely see why a philosopher would want to be here, because there are all these people who are already, of course, doing lots of interdisciplinary work themselves, but philosophers, I think, fit very naturally into that kind of extended conversation about more or less anything.
But that's one of the things you have done. You have taken philosophy and you have once again made it what used to be called one of the moral sciences, yes, along with economics, history. Even history is a moral science. Yes. And so one of the questions, you've done precisely what you just said we should hire someone to do. Are you available? But I guess my question was going to be, what do you see as the boundaries, the relationship between philosophy and those other moral sciences? What does philosophy bring to them and get from them? I'm just asking for a historian.
No. I mean, I think that if you think about many of the great figures in the history of let's say, European philosophy, I think of David Hume. I mean, David Hume was an historian. He wrote a 5-volume history of England, as well as being one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment. I think, and in a way, something happened to all the disciplines in the later 19th century. They became more focused, more professionalized. And in philosophy, that in the English-speaking world, that particularly, I think, accelerated in the pre-Second World War period. And in that period, the way you sort of got to be respected as a philosopher was by talking about things that only philosophers talked about. So that someone like John Dewey, who in the generation before was obvious, everyone recognized as one of the great American philosophers, what he did wasn't a good way to get a chair at the Institute. So I think that it is good for us to remember that. To remember two things, I think. One is that that specialization has had enormous benefits as well as costs. So I'm not against that. And in a way, a lot of what's happened is that the things that are called philosophy or philosophie or in the European languages, Western European languages, have essentially budded off. Newton's chair was in natural philosophy. As I said, a lot of John Stuart Mill's work was in what we would call economics, and he wrote books with the word economics in the title. In the period just after the Second World War, one of the things that budded off was linguistics, and logic was much closer to philosophy in the time of Gödel than it is now, but that doesn't mean there aren't philosophers deeply engaged with the kind of logic that logicians are still doing. It's just that it's not as central to what philosophers do as it was in the time of Gödel. So philosophy has a history, things bud off, but we keep trying to pull them back in a way, or at least pull back from them, not the details perhaps, but what they teach us about our place in the world and about the sort of world we live in. I don't think you can do serious metaphysics, that is, say what there is, ontology, these days without knowing an awful lot of physics, because physics is the fundamental subject about what there really is, what the world is really composed of, and so on. Now, you can't think of the world just as composed of physical things, even if everything in the world is in some sense composed of physical things, because there's also a social ontology, and there's also a biological ontology. There are cells just as much as there are the molecules that make up the cells. There are the cells, and just as the cells make up the organisms, there are the organisms, and just as there are the organisms, there are also the societies, the collections of organisms, right. Ant colonies or human towns. So I don't mean to say that there's a sense in which physics is about fundamental ontology, because it's about the kind of ontology that applies right across the universe. There's no biology off this planet, basically.
You know, you said so many things in that many of them resonated with me. Like you mentioned Hume. Hume said that history is the confirmation of true philosophy. So I feel like that's great for historians. It makes us the arbiters of what true philosophy is. You mentioned logic, and we have a lot of math. Well, Gödel, but also many long tradition in logic here. Why? I think you've been one of the pioneers in taking philosophy away from an emphasis just on logic and its application to language and extending it out into the world. I'm going to ask for my mathematical friends, why isn't logic enough?
I think the answer to that question has to do not with what the world is like, but with what we are like. We are equipped in our dealings with the world with many, many different kinds of theories, and we can't integrate them into a single big theory. That's a limitation. Maybe that's a limitation of ours, but maybe God could do it. But we can't. And so we need little, as it were, local theories of things in order to... So logic's sort of relevant to every subject matter, but it can't exhaust every subject matter, because some of our theories are about what we should do, and some of our theories are about what organisms are made of, and so on. And that stuff is not logic. So we need mathematical tools in not just in philosophy. I think we need. Cryometricians in your field use mathematical skills tools to think about historical questions. Lots of social science is now uses much more powerful mathematical tools than would have been done by a sociologist in the 1930s, say. So I think math is useful everywhere. My dissertation was actually about something called probabilistic semantics, which involved doing a little bit of mathematics. But that can't be all of it, because we need many pictures to guide us through the world, and we can't subsume them into a single picture. So that's why, as it were, physics isn't the only subject. It's the most general subject in some sense, but it's not, we couldn't manage, you can't think about how to vote by reducing every question to a question in physics.
You know, that's a very, we're going to return to that question, the question of the relationship between one of your fields, ethics, and the field you just mentioned, voting, politics. But before we do that, let's talk about this field that I think you have done more to reinvigorate than anyone else I know, the field of ethics and morality, which are fields that analytic philosophy had, to a certain degree, deprecated for a while. Yes. First, maybe you could tell us the difference between ethics and morality. Those are... Okay.
I mean, this is how I use those two words. I'm not recommending that lexicographers put my definitions in the dictionary, but I think it's useful to distinguish two things, and I use those two words to distinguish them. One is, ethics is what Aristotle meant it to be, the study of what it is to live well, to have a successful human life, to be what he called eudaimon, which is flourishing. That's what ethics is about. But there's a sub-part of what it is to live well, which has to do with how you treat other people. Not everything about living well has to do with how we treat others. We have our own projects. We need to look after ourselves as well to live well. But there's a sort of subset of questions about how to live well that has to do with what we owe to other people. And I would use the word morality for that. I think that a lot of contemporary people use the word moral, the word ethical, to refer mostly to moral questions, what I'm calling moral questions. I think that leaves out a huge part of the subject. Because, as I say, living well, of course, requires you to treat your other people in general, but also your partners and your children and your parents and your friends and your colleagues in the right way, and that's all morality. And some of that is professional ethics, has to do with how you should treat your colleagues and your clients, your students if you're a teacher, or your patients if you're a doctor, or your clients if you're a lawyer. But so I think it's very important that once you start thinking about what it is to live well, two things come very clearly into focus. One is the need to do the experiments in ethics thing, because there's science about what it is to live well. It isn't just a scientific question, but what's good for human beings is partly a matter of how our brains work and how our bodies work, and so one needs to know about that. But also, in order to think properly about what it is to live well, you have to understand that we are, as Aristotle said, a zoon politikon, a creature of the polis, of the city-state, in other words, a political animal, and you can't really think about what it is to live as a human among humans without thinking at least a little bit about political science and sociology and history. So philosophy, so ethics in that broad sense can't ignore all those things. I mean, in the end, of course, there are sort of engineering questions about how to live well, and you need the physicists and the engineers to answer those.
I might point out something I don't know if you know, but the Experiments in Ethics lectures you gave, which is a beautiful book, and I recommend it to everybody, available on Amazon.com, was given as a Mary Flexner lecture, which was funded at Bryn Mawr by our founder, Abraham Flexner, and his brother in honor of their sister. So there is an intricate web that weaves you to the Institute, even though you may not know it.
That's good to know.
Morality, one often comes up with universal rules, like the golden rule.
Yes.
But living well, that seems like what would be a universal ground for an ethics? Doesn't it mean something very different to many different people?
Yes, and that's one of the important points, one of the important insights of modern identity theory, I think, which is that there are at least two kinds of things that are relevant to what it is for me to live well and for you to live well that are going to be different for you and for me. One is that we are engaged in different projects. There may be some higher level at which we're engaged in the same project, but we're professionals in different fields, and we are pursuing different, so as it were, more local ends. And if you have a vocation as a novelist, your life doesn't go well unless you write some decent novels. But if you don't have a vocation as a novelist, it doesn't matter whether you write any novels, right? Nothing is taken away from the life of a person who doesn't have a vocation as a novelist by their not writing novels. And indeed, I would say the opposite, which is perhaps a slightly more controversial thing, which is I think there are people in whose lives their novels are accidental. They don't really add much. They may even be quite good, but that's not what they were up to. They were up to something else. And certainly that's true of poems. Many people who were not up to poetry have written one good poem. I might claim that of myself. So that's one thing. We're engaged in different projects. But also, of course, and this is the identity point, we have different non-chosen things that are relevant. I didn't choose to be a man. I just, as it were, discovered I was a man. But that's relevant to what it is for me to live well. I did choose to be an American, and that became relevant for me, for what it is for me to live well. I'm the kind of American who thinks that when my country does well, I do well, not consequentially, not because my country's doing well, but because it's an intrinsic part of my good that my country should do well. And obviously, therefore, if my country does badly, that's an intrinsic deficit. Aristotle thought, and I think he's right about this, that your children's successes after you die are part of what it is for your life to have gone well. He didn't think you knew about them, so it wasn't because it had an impact on you, it was because your well-being was tied up with the well-being of the people with whom you were, your friends and your family. So our relationships make a difference. The welfare of my spouse plays a special role in my welfare. The welfare of your spouse plays a special role in your welfare.
You said it.
Yes, and I don't. Lovely as she is, she doesn't play a special role in my welfare. She just plays the role of another decent human being whom I'm pleased to know. So friends, family, but also many other kinds of relationships affect what it is for my life to go well. And the result of that is that whatever the measure is of my life going well, it's not the same as your measure. And in that sense, no two people are up to the same ethical thing. We each have our own, as it were, distinct ethical profile. And that's one of the reasons why I think questions people sometimes want to ask, like, did Einstein have a better life than Mozart? Or vice versa. I just think that's a daft question. Mozart had a great musician's life, even if it wasn't very long. And Einstein had a wonderful mathematician, physicist, philanthropist's life. And so I think that's a very important point about ethics, that however you choose to model and measure human welfare, the measure has to be different. Herder actually said this. Herder said everybody has their own measure. And I think that's completely right.
Herder said many fascinating. He also said every successful philosophy, wherever philosophy was victorious, it was built on the ruins of mathematics and physics. Sorry, guys.
Well, that's one thing he was wrong about.
So you've just said something I think really important. On the one hand, ethics at the individual level, and one cannot really speak in very normative terms about them or universalist terms about it. On the other hand, you also connected ethics to politics. So how does ethics connect to politics and to polis?
Yes. I mean, in two ways, I think. One is that you can't think as a citizen about what you want your state to do without having some idea about what would be good for its citizens. You need to know what the ethical situation is of your fellow citizens in order to think about managing a society in which we can all flourish. So ethics, in that sense, is a kind of, Aristotle, again, I don't know why I keep talking about Aristotle, except that he seems to be right about a lot of things. Aristotle, did the ethics before the politics, and he thought but he did say that ethics was part of political science, or the knowledge of how to live in the polis. And because we are a zoon political, we can't really live, we humans can't really live without organized society. And even if maybe a few people could have in the past, when there were fewer of us and more space to range in, certainly can't do it now. Everybody in the world is now in a territory occupied by some state. Unfortunately, not all of them have states, because we deny statehood. States, there are stateless people, and that's a terrible thing. But those stateless people are in the command of some state there somewhere. And so you have to live in a state, and that means that so that part of morality, which needs to take into account the ethical situation of everybody in the world, but especially your fellow citizens, is paying attention to what's good for the other people around you. So you can't do politics properly if you don't have any ethical picture. Where by an ethical picture, I don't mean a moral picture. You need a moral picture as well, but you need an ethical picture. You need a picture of what are we all... I'm boringly a kind of liberal, so I think that it's a central part of politics that we should allow people to play the central role in deciding how their lives will go, that it's not to be decided for them by others. They have to be in dialogue with other people, but you want a society in which people are as free as possible to find their own way, including to make mistakes. So you can't correct someone just, there's an ethical mistake involved in correcting someone just because they've made a mistake. I'm trying to force them not to make the mistake. There are some mistakes that are yours to make, and that's a sort of broadly liberal thought, and I think that's a very deep insight. And it's an insight that doesn't really belong to any particular global tradition. I think all around the world there are people who've acquired the thought that the state has a place, a very important place, but that in managing one's own life, I am the boss of me. You are not the boss of me. The government is the boss of me. My parents aren't the boss of me. My children aren't the boss of me. It's my responsibility to manage my own life. Ronnie Dworkin used to say, everybody has a non-delegable responsibility to manage their own life.
I was going to ask you, you've written about, in defense of many ethico-political, can I call them ethico-political ideas? Liberalism being one of them, pluralism another. And I wasn't going to ask you this, but you just said I'm a liberal, so I wanted to ask you, I think in the preface to the reprint of Ethics of Identity, you actually engage in a defense of liberalism, given the shifts, the attacks on liberalism that have happened since you first wrote the book. And I guess my question would be, so how do you respond to the recent attacks on the last? Liberalism is in crisis, and there have been many attacks on it. Why do you remain a liberal?
Well, one thing that often happens in public life, especially I think in political life, is that people attach a negative valence to a term in part by misrepresenting the thing that they're attacking. So let me be clear that what I'm defending is something like the sort of liberalism articulated in Rawls's theory of justice, which has two central thoughts. One is that everybody has a set of rights which they're entitled to and which states have to respect, but also other people have to respect. And the other is that society needs to be organized in such a way as to, now I'm going to differ from Rawls a little bit, well, maybe a lot, but anyway. The society needs to be organized in such a way that that everybody has a decent shot at a dignified human life. Those are the two central liberal ideas, I think. Now, liberals disagree about what the second thing means in practice. Some people think it means a more active state in the economy than others. But in a way, those are disagreements about method. I think that you could get most liberals to agree that the state needs to offer the opportunity of a dignified existence to all of its citizens, and that it should bear that in mind in its relation with other states, that it shouldn't ignore the fact that someone isn't a citizen of your state doesn't mean they aren't also entitled to a dignified existence. But because the measure of flourishing is different for different people, that will mean different things to different people. If I am a Catholic, I need access to priests and churches. But I'm not a Catholic, so I don't need access to Catholic priests and churches. But because there are a lot of Catholics, I think it's important that they have access to, not for me, but for them, that they have access to those things. And I've forgotten what this question began about, but liberalism. So then there are lots of family squabbles among liberals. What are the rights? How do you guarantee dignity? What does dignity amount to? Those are all perfectly reasonable things for people to disagree about. In that sense, I think a lot of people who use the word liberal as a term of sort of sneering abuse are actually, if you said to them, which of these things I just said are you against? Right. Are you really against the idea that we should organize society in such a way that everybody should have a shot at a decent, dignified life? Are you really against the idea that everybody has rights? Are you really against this idea that I mentioned before, that everybody should be in charge, everybody's the boss of them? Everybody should be in charge of their own life. I suspect that the people who sort of use liberalism as a term of abuse are opposed to things, some of which I'm in favor of, but they're not. But that's because we disagree about something else. We don't really disagree that people have rights, I don't think, at least most of them. I mean, look, our fellow citizens are extremely diverse, and I'm sure there's some of them who have any possible view. So I can't be sure that everybody is, but I think an awful lot more people are in this broadly liberal box and my articulation of it is not sort of arbitrary or random. I think this is, roughly speaking, what philosophers have meant by liberal for a long time. The first liberals didn't have the word liberal, so the word liberal doesn't get used until the early 19th century. But I think a lot of Americans who would say they're not liberal would nevertheless recognize the value of the sort of rights that, say, John Locke celebrated, or ideas about religious toleration.
You have coined a new, you haven't exactly coined it, but you've really developed this new ethical, political category of cosmopolitanism. Can you tell us what that is and why it feels so important at present?
Yes. This is another of the words where the enemies have now redefined the project. So let me say what the project is. I mean, Barack Obama and the, what's he called, the senator from Josh Hawley, have both criticized cosmopolitanism. So I'm in apparently a tiny minority here. But look,
have they read the book?
Actually, I'm pretty certain that President Obama has read the book. Because I know a little bit about his teaching practices, because I did a program for the BBC when he was elected called Professor President. And I talked to a lot of people about what he read, and I looked at a lot of his syllabi. And when he gave me the National Humanities Medal, he said, and he was, I think he's an honest person, he said, "I admire your work." So I told him I admired his work too. And he said, his response to that was, "No, I'm serious." And then he complained that I'd stolen the title he wanted for his first book, because he wanted to call his first book In My Father's House. Anyway, look, cosmopolitanism, it's an old word, at least as far back as the 4th century. Diogenes of Sinope used the word, according to Diogenes Laertius anyway. And it means, etymologically, it just means a citizen of the cosmos, of the world, or the universe or something. So that's an old idea. I think, and that word gets used from time to time in the history of European philosophy. Kant, of course, used it in Perpetual Peace to talk about what he called cosmopolitan right. The thing that I want to defend under that label, and again, I'm not saying this should be in the dictionary, but here's what I want to defend is a particular understanding of what it is to think of yourself as a fellow citizen of every human being, which is the central metaphor of cosmopolitanism. It's two things. One is that we have moral responsibilities to everybody. And I think that's the, as it were, compulsory part of cosmopolitanism. I think somebody who denies that, who says about some other person in the world, well, they just don't matter, is making a profound ethical mistake. I think everybody in the world does matter. But you don't have to have the second part of cosmopolitanism, which is, this is the voluntary part, which I would urge on people, but I wouldn't condemn them for not going along with, which is valuing and taking pleasure in interacting with people who are different from you. People from other societies, I would add, for Americans, other political parties, other religions, other parts of the country. And that pleasure in interaction with strangers is something that we actually need for national politics, because though the world is a world of strangers, so is the nation. Mm-hmm. I couldn't possibly know 335 million other people. So we have to run the society together as a community of strangers, of people who don't know each other. But nevertheless, and to do that, we have to, I think, recognize, because everybody has their own measure, that means that we will be interacting with people from whom we will get different things. We will get different ideas, different musics, different arts, different literatures, different sports, and so on. And I think that, you know, it's just enormously enjoyable.
You make it sound wonderful. Yeah.
Now, when people criticize cosmopolitanism, when President Obama criticizes cosmopolitanism, what he has in mind is people who substitute for their responsibility to their fellow citizens a sense of generalized responsibility to everybody. But that's ridiculous. Diogenes, well, Diogenes might have meant that because he was a weird guy. But most cosmopolitans have been able to be, as I once wrote a paper with this title, cosmopolitan patriots. You can perfectly well think that you're the fellow citizen in some metaphorical sense of everybody in the world, while still thinking that you're the literal fellow citizen of your fellow national citizens, and that you have more responsibilities to them than you do to people in general, just as I have more responsibilities to my family than I do to people in general. When people say they find this difficult to understand, I say to them, look, when I'm voting for the mayor of New York, which is a dangerous activity because, well, for reasons those of you who follow New York politics will know, I think about, it's reasonable for me to be thinking about the city, not about the country or the world. I shouldn't want my city to be a bad city, American city, or a bad global city, but its issues are its own issues. I'm allowed to think about those. When I'm voting for the governor of New York, I'm thinking about New York State, which is not the same as Alabama or California. I can be a loyal citizen of New York City, New York State, the United States, and the world. And if I can't be a loyal citizen of the United States and the world, how can I be what are the arguments that I can be a loyal citizen of New York City and New York State and the United States? So I think that, of course, these levels of identity will pull you in different directions sometimes. So you have choices to make. But my experience is, and I grew up with a very cosmopolitan father. He was Ghanaian. Well, he wasn't Ghanaian because Ghana didn't exist when he was young. He was a Gold Coast colonial subject. He went to school to study law in London. In the course of, and he married an English woman, my mother. In the course of his life, he worked for the United Nations for a bit. He worked for the International Commission of Jurists. He was a lawyer. He was not only president of the Ghana Bar Association, he was president of the West African Bar Association. So he did things at many levels of citizenship. And I've never heard him say, oh, difficult choice. Should I act today as president of the West African Bar or of the African Bar? No, rule of law is what it matters to lawyers, and it matters in your country, and it matters in the country next door. So I think people can exaggerate the tensions. Now, I'm very privileged in many ways, and one of the privileges of my life was growing up between two societies and being loved by families in both of them and knowing a great deal about both of them. And I remember as a child flying, because my parents' marriage was famous when we were young, journalists tended to show up and ask us questions about our lives. And I remember them asking us these questions that suggested that there was some huge challenge about living in two families. But everybody who's in a normal family lives in two families, right? I mean, you've got your dad's family and your mum's family, and if you're lucky, and most people have that good fortune. So the idea that you grow up in it and you know how to do it, and you can grow up, and I did grow up because of my parents, as a kind of natural cosmopolitan. I mean, my mother's favorite poet was Basho, Japanese fellow, and she wrote haiku herself, published some. We followed what happened in the United States from Ghana as a child. We took interest in that. We knew things about Brazil. We read fiction from around the world. And we watched movies from around the world. There were a lot of Indian movies shown in our local movie theater in Kumasi in Ghana. And it didn't seem very difficult. In fact, it seemed natural, and the difficult thing would have been cutting it all out, getting rid of it. And when people say, well, isn't it important to celebrate the national literature? Sure. But the national literature of the United Kingdom includes plays by a guy whose most famous character is a Dane, who read an awful lot of Roman literature in order to write Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and so on, who stole the sonnet form, as did other English poets, from Petrarch, who was an Italian, and wrote some of the greatest sonnets in the English language. What would it have been like if someone had said to Shakespeare, you have to be English? right? What would have been improved by that? Nothing. So that's the thought.
All the Italian plays would be lost.
Yes.
I
Romeo and Juliet.
My last question. I have many more, but I'm going to hold it down to one. So one of the things about ethics is that wherever it draws its norms from, and often it draws them from very ancient things like religion, or wherever it draws its norms from, it has to adapt to an ever-changing present. And your column in the New York Times makes that clear with every questioner. I'm thinking of a recent one: should you be allowed to profit from AI-generated art?
Yeah.
So my question for you is, how do you develop ethical norms for new presents?
Well, I think the first important thing to say about that is that these are developed in dialogue with everybody. That new, or at least with, as it were, with the relevant people. So maybe it's artists when we're thinking about AI and art, artists and the consumers of art, which is basically everybody. So I can't decide, by myself, as it were, what the right answer is to these things. These practices grow and develop. They grow and develop on the basis of drawing analogies with understandings that developed with older practices. I actually was discussing with a graduate student today who's writing a dissertation about copyright, so she's been thinking about these things. But think about how our idea of authorship had to evolve to apply copyright thinking to films. Who is the author of a film? Who makes a film? Who's the creative person? Lots of people. So how do we decide? Well, part of that is settled by complicated contractual arrangements, which is fine. But part of it is because we have a developing understanding of a genre, like movies, and of what it means. So some of us are in that conversation. Some of us are watching that conversation, trying to analyze it, trying to think about what moves seem sensible, what analogies seem daft, and what analogies seem reasonable, and so on. But I suppose what I feel is that there isn't an answer that we're struggling towards. We have to make an answer. And we can do it in a variety of ways, all equally human and reasonable, and we will do it in...
Or unreasonable.
Or unreasonable, or sort of kind of indifferent to reason, right? It's just how we feel about something. Right. As Pascal said, the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know. So I think that's the answer. We have think about the great political slogan of the 18th century: liberty, equality, fraternity. We didn't know what we meant by equality exactly at the time of the French Revolution. We have learned. It wasn't obvious, for example, at the time of the French Revolution to everybody, it was to some people, but it wasn't to everybody, that this had big relevance to the question of how men and women should relate to one another. Right? The French Revolution talked about equality without really, as I say, there were people who thought about gender equality, but it wasn't central. I don't think that when people started thinking about equality, we had the intellectual apparatus to see that because everybody has their own measure, it's actually quite hard to say what it is to treat people equally, right? If everybody was the same, it would be easy to treat them equally. But it isn't easy to treat people equally because, to use an example that I've used before, if one of your children plays tennis and the other plays golf, equality doesn't consist in giving them both a golf club. Right? Presumably, you give a golf club to the one that plays golf and a tennis racket to the one that plays tennis. And since golf clubs and tennis rackets are of different prices, no doubt, you have to think about maybe you should give the one who's got the rackets and balls as well because of the cost of see what I mean? So I think equality is hard.
Yeah.
Because people need different things, because people are different. People have different measures. And that is And with that, we're still, as I say, we're still working on that. And the same is true of freedom, of course. What is it to be free? Is a person who has to work at a job they hate free? Or shouldn't we organize society in such a way that everybody has a chance at finding a job that they gain pleasure from or value from, and so on?
Well, that was a wonderful illustration, too, of the relationship of ethics to politics.
And to history.
And history. And the entire conversation also demonstrates that you have done much more than your fair share to help the Institute stare philosophy in the face and help the world understand why philosophy makes a difference. Thank you.
Thank you.